When you kill innocent children, innocent babies, little babies, with a chemical gas that is so lethal, people were shocked to hear what gas it was. That crosses many, many lines, beyond the red line, many, many lines.
President Trump explaining a sudden change in his policy towards the Assad regime just one day before ordering a strike on a Syrian airbase. And it's time now for our Sunday group. Bill Kristol from the Weekly Standard, Fox News political analyst and columnist for The Hill, Juan Williams, Elleithee of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics and Public Service, and Washington Examiner contributor Lisa Boothe. Bill, you heard General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, at the top of the show. Are you satisfied that this administration has a clear strategy for going forward in Syria? And particularly the question I asked, which was, is this just about chemical weapons, or is the president prepared to act if there's just, by conventional means, the slaughter of civilians?
I think they've at least done what they had to have done to lay the predicate for having a clear strategy. They haven't worked it all out. But if he had not acted now, we would be in even worse shape than after President Obama didn't enforce his red line with such a visible violation of international norms and of what Syria had committed to when it allegedly got rid of all these chemical weapons. So let them work out the strategy. I have a lot of confidence in H.R. McMaster. I do think when historians, if the Trump administration ends up non-disastrously, the replacement...
Non-disastrously?
That's my standard for the Trump, yes. If it does, and I'm hopeful it does, don't get me wrong, I'm hopeful it does, the replacement of Mike Flynn by H.R. McMaster as National Security Advisor could really be an important moment. Because looking at it from the outside, what struck me, and I think you noted this too, Chris, during the week, it seemed like there's a crisis and they handled it competently. You could agree or disagree. Do they have a long-term strategy?
No,
who knows?
clearly.
But in terms of just the execution of this 72 hours, meetings, diplomacy and military stuff coordinated, keeping it secret, that was impressive. So that reassures you. If you think the Trump White House so far has been a little bit of a chaotic place, you feel like, gee, H.R. McMaster has the national security side of it under control.
We asked you for questions for the panel, and on this issue of what the missile strike means for President Trump's larger foreign policy, Michael Lodge sent this on Facebook. Since the justified attack by the U.S. on Syria, was this truly a clear enough signal to world leaders that America is back in charge? Juan, how do you answer Michael?
Well, I think that if you're sitting there having lunch and dinner, as President Xi of China was, it's got to send some kind of message, especially with regard to North Korea. Now, if you look around the world, there are a lot of hot spots, though, and there are a lot of reasons for the U.S. to exercise some moral authority. President Trump, as a candidate, said if it's not about U.S. economic interests, if it's not about U.S. national security interests, it's no business of the United States. And as you know, he encouraged President Obama, don't get involved with Syria. So there is no doctrine, Chris. And when I was listening to your interview with McMaster, I look forward to it because I wanted to understand what is the rationale? How do they sell this to the American people? How do they sell it to the person asking the question this morning? And there is none. He doesn't say, you know what, conventional weapons are continuing to kill people in Syria, and we find this abhorrent, and we will stop it. No, he did not say that to you. He's not clear what the next step is.
Let's turn to the other big story this week. Normally, this would be dominating the news, and that was Republicans in the Senate invoking the nuclear option in order to confirm Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Here are the Senate's two leaders.
I believe it will make this body a more partisan place. It will make the cooling saucer of the Senate considerably hotter.
I hope my Democratic friends will take this moment to reflect and perhaps consider a turning point in their outlook going forward.
Lisa, that's what I want to talk about with you, is where the Senate goes from here, particularly on Supreme Court nominations. This is something I brought up with the two senators in the last segment. It seems to me, and this isn't just Trump and Republicans, it'll be true of the next Democratic president when he has a Democratic majority. Doesn't this increase the likelihood that when a president's in that situation, he's going to appoint somebody that is more to the extreme, more in line with his base, because he doesn't have to, he or she doesn't have to reach out to the other side because they know there's not going to be a filibuster?
Yeah, potentially. But I mean, you also have to look at the fact that really going back to 2003, prior to Miguel Estrada, no judicial nominee with a clear majority had essentially been blocked by a filibuster. Then you also go to 2006 with President Obama leading the filibuster attempt against Justice Alito. And then it was the Democratic Party in 2013 that changed the rules for the lower courts.
I know. I mean, this goes back and forth. There's nobody with clean hands here. Cardin's right. But my point is, going forward, there was at least this self-limiting factor. Well, maybe we got to reach out to the other side. Is that gone now?
I mean, yeah, potentially, but I don't necessarily think, I don't think the onus is on the Republican Party. I think we're just seeing politics as a whole getting increasingly more partisan. But the point being is, going back to 2003, you really didn't see the filibuster being used in a partisan manner. So I don't know if this is fundamentally changing the rules when you just go back to 2003, where we really saw at least a party using it for, sort of a partisan.
But it's gone on. I mean,
yes,
you had Merrick Garland. There may be an original sin here, but there's not one party that.
To answer your question, I mean, sure, but I also think that that's happening regardless of what just recently happened in the Senate. I think that is the direction that party politics is heading.
Mo, if I'm right, and I know that's a very distant possibility. If what I said is not disastrous to use Bill Kristol's new standard, did Democrats make a strategic mistake filibustering this one because it opens the door for President Trump with his next appointment if he gets another appointment?
Yeah, it's hard to say. And I'm with you, and I'm with Senator Cardin that both sides have some of the blame here. My party has a lot of blame for the way it acted, and I think maybe the filibuster may have been a poor judgment. I also think the Republicans, I mean, the fact that Merrick Garland couldn't even get a hearing, right? And we do go back and forth. I'm usually a fairly optimistic guy. This is a case where I am very pessimistic. You hear senators now saying, well, we went nuclear on nominations. There's no way that's going to happen on legislation. I'm not so sure, right? What's going to happen the first time there's a contentious piece of legislation that's up there and the partisan heels dig in even more? I think we are entering a very tenuous time for the United States Senate, where it is going to become a lot more raucous. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing when there's a lot of raucousness around now in this town that needs to be checked.
I want to pick up on raucousness because there's raucousness inside the Trump White House, and I want to talk about that with you, Bill. Let's be honest, with all of the big events, this is really what's got Washington buzzing, this apparent split inside the White House between the so-called nationalists, led by Steve Bannon appropriately on the right there, and the so-called New Yorkers or Democrats, led by Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, over the direction of the Trump presidency. Bill, what are you hearing? How bad is it, and is anybody going to be forced out?
I think it's bad, or at least dramatic. I don't know if Bannon will be, he'll be, I think, pushed aside some. I doubt if he'll be forced out immediately. What shows me who has the upper hand is this. I saw a New York Times, there was a New York Times story, I think it was today or yesterday, and the sort of the slug that one saw going, originally was Trump had called in these two top aides and told them, work it out. Right. So I saw that and I thought, well, the two aides who had to work it out obviously were Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner. Those are the two guys who were at loggerheads. No, Trump had called in Steve Bannon and Reince Priebus and told them to work it out with Jared Kushner. Now, what does that tell you? You've been around organizations. Well, Kushner is in the driver's seat. Trump is telling his chief of staff and his top strategist, you get along with Jared Kushner. So Jared Kushner, in my opinion, is the most powerful man in domestic policy, at least, in the White House today.
Lisa, beyond the obvious Game of Thrones side of this, who's up and who's down, what's the significance, whether it's the Bannon wing or the Kushner wing, in terms of policy for this presidency? Personally,
I don't think it's as significant as it's being made out to be, because the reality, everyone is basically putting this at the premise of somehow, President Trump is being, as a puppet of either Steve Bannon or Priebus or whoever's in charge, Jared Kushner. The reality is, this is a guy, I think people are they're not giving him enough credit. This is a guy in 2012 who trademarked Make America Great Again, a guy who defeated 16 candidates in the primary, who defeated Hillary Clinton, who outspent him 2-1, and if you include outside groups, 3-1, and did all this with 3 separate campaign managers. I mean, so this is a guy who's very smart politically, who's a lot more adept than anyone wants to give him credit for. So the idea of who's at the helm in regards to the chief of staff or whatever that role is, I think is irrelevant. Well, I don't think it's as big of a deal as
we're out of time. I suspect this is going to continue. It may be irrelevant, but it is kind of interesting.
It is interesting.
It is what we do. Thank you, panel.